Hello. I'm having some issues with my phone today, so I'm going to make an old-style Real Crusades history podcast. In fact, I miss this format, personally. I may do this more often here and there. All right, so what we're going to talk about today is motivation among historical figures, and what we can know about it, and reasonable speculations that we can make about such motivation. So I've been enjoying quite a bit lately a scholar by the name of Richard Brown. And Richard Brown is doing some important stuff. He is making available primary source accounts related to the Normans of southern Italy and Sicily. And he is doing this at a very affordable price. I'm holding in my hands right now his edition of Geoffrey of Malaterra, which he published under the title Count Roger of Sicily, Portrait of a Ruler. So Geoffrey of Malaterra is one of the most important chroniclers for the Normans of the South, in particular of Roger of Sicily and his career in the conquest of Sicily. And, I think prior to Brown releasing these editions, these were only available as very expensive works published by universities. I know there's an edition of Geoffrey of Malaterra from Kenneth Baxter, which is very expensive. It runs $100 or so. And this edition you can get for about $13 from Richard Brown. I believe he publishes these himself, but he's doing a great service. And I'm very much glad he's doing it. So one thing that Brown points out, and another good thing in his translations, is he provides a lot of notes, a lot of context, so that these primary sources can be easily enjoyed by anybody. And one thing he points out is that the Normans, in their Sicilian campaigns, as they were conquering Sicily, they promoted these campaigns as holy wars. This is how they presented these campaigns to, Christendom at large, to the Pope. They promoted this as, we are engaged in war against the infidels. We are retaking Sicily for Christendom. We are, good sons of Christendom. Look at what we're doing here. The chroniclers employed by the Normans made this explicit. And one example of this, of course, is Geoffrey of Malaterra himself. This account from Geoffrey of Malaterra very clearly portrays the Norman conquest of Sicily as almost a proto-crusade. This is a holy war. This is, these are warriors of Christendom defeating the infidels. This is how Malaterra portrays this. And one interesting thing about this is the fact that Roger himself, Count Roger of Sicily, now just for some context, Roger is the younger brother of Robert Guiscard, who was the most important Norman ruler in southern Italy. And Roger kind of adopted Sicily as his pet project, and he was the one who was really pushing the conquest in Sicily, relying on support from his brother, of course, but he came to be known as the Great Count of Sicily. So Sicily was kind of his own domain in this wider Norman conquest of, the southern Italian peninsula and Sicily. So one thing that's interesting about this chronicle from Geoffrey of Malaterra is that Roger himself was very closely involved in the creation of it and really imparted to Geoffrey the vision he wanted presented, how he wanted this portrayed. And Malaterra tells us this explicitly in many places throughout the chronicle. Now, Geoffrey of Malaterra himself was probably of Norman origin. I believe all he says is that he comes from, north of the Alps or something like this. So we don't know exactly where he's from. But he was a monk, and he came to settle in Sicily as Roger and his Normans were conquering this territory, taking it from the Muslims. Geoffrey was one of many churchmen, religious men, both Latin and Greek. One thing about Roger is he was inviting many Greek Orthodox to settle in Sicily as well. He was very positive in his feelings toward the Greek Christians. But Malaterra was a Latin, of course. And Roger was very involved in how this whole thing was portrayed, how this account was written. And so it's very clear then that Roger himself wanted to be portrayed as a crusader, as a holy warrior. Roger wanted the world, as it was absorbing this story that was presented in this chronicle, to view what he had done in Sicily as a holy war, as a fight for Christendom. Okay, so of course the question does come up: were the Normans really motivated by piety? Was Roger genuinely, a crusader in his heart? Was he motivated from his heart to do this? To wage this holy war, or did he think to himself, "This is a useful propaganda tool. I can portray myself as this warrior for the faith to the wider Christendom community, the wider community of Christendom, and I will be valued, and what I'm doing here will be valued, and this will help my kingdom, help my lands prosper. It will gain support from the church, all of this." So this is an interesting question that we can ask. I do think, though, we have to be careful about, when we ask this question, we need to be careful about thinking about Christian piety in modern terms. Because I do think that when we think of piety today, if somebody just imagines Christian piety today, they think of, the way that Christians tend to feel about their religion today. More these sort of feelings that you would find in a Christian today, and most mainstream Christians. This is very different, I think, from how Christianity was generally experienced in the 11th century. It was a bit of a rougher time period. So we do have to be careful about that, and we'll get more to that in a moment here. But my point really is just that if we imagine that Count Roger was motivated by religion, we shouldn't assume that means he had to be sort of this very sentimental type Christian that you might see on TV today or something like that. If you get what I'm saying, I just want to point that out. So, just carrying on here, in his notes, Brown states there are reasons for questioning whether or not the Normans were motivated by piety in their conquest of Sicily. And I think this is fair, The fact is, we can't know for sure what was in the hearts of these men, so we have to just, understand that. But this is a fair question to ask, and I think it invites some useful discussion and reflection. So Brown lists several reasons that he thinks call into question the piety of the Normans in their conquest of Sicily. First of all, he says they were willing to make alliances with Muslim lords. One example of this is an alliance they made with the emir Ibn Timna. Now, Ibn Timna was one of many feuding emirs on the island of Sicily. When the Normans arrived, on the island of Sicily in the 1060s, the Muslim rulers there were not united. They were fighting each other. They were warring with one another for control. There was a lot of internal feuding going on. There were some North African princes involved, those elements there. So there was a lot of tension. And one thing that the Normans did immediately was make an alliance with a Muslim emir who was fighting other Muslim emirs. So Brown lists this. Next, Brown says they did not force conversion. So when the Normans conquered, a city or a territory in Sicily, they didn't force the Muslim population to convert. And lastly, Brown says they used Saracen mercenaries. So they used Muslim mercenaries. Now, if you are familiar with the history of the Crusades in Spain and Portugal and the Holy Land, none of this is really going to surprise you. I don't think any of these particular reasons really give us much strong indication one way or another about the motivations of the Normans in the south. These practices were basically universal. They are found in holy war throughout the medieval era, practiced by both sides, Muslims and Christians. If we look at an organization like the Knights Templar, for example, this is stuff the Templars did. The Templars were willing to make alliances with Muslim rulers if it benefited them and their cause. They did not force conversions among their subject Muslims, and they were willing to use Muslim mercenaries. So I think that all of these practices point primarily to pragmatism. Pragmatism may be the best explanation for all of these. The reality here is that the Normans, when they entered Sicily, it was very precarious. They did not have a lot of men. The Muslim cities of Sicily were very well defended, very wealthy. It made a lot of sense to get a foot in the door by forming alliances with some of the local rulers, especially since they were fighting the rulers that the Normans themselves wanted to fight. The forcing of conversions. Now, this is one of those things that a lot of people, when they imagine the Middle Ages, they think that everybody was going around forcing everybody to convert. But forced conversions were actually pretty rare in the Middle Ages, I think. I think that's very clear. Especially in the history of Holy War, we're looking at the interactions between Christians and Muslims. They were probably more common within the religions themselves, like within sects fighting each other within these two great faiths. But when Christians and Muslims were fighting each other and conquering each other, they tended to let subject populations practice their religion. Why? Because it makes practical sense. You can tax them. Imagine how difficult it would be to force, through violence, some large population to convert when really you'd rather just, get income out of them. I don't think there's much indication that medieval Muslims and Christians felt that Holy War required that subject populations be converted. The idea was more that if they are subdued and your own religion is triumphant and the great buildings in the city belong to your faith, that is what's more important. And then, of course, the use of Saracen mercenaries. This is a fairly pragmatic thing, too. And Brown himself does kind of indicate this in his notes. On page 81, he says, "These accounts come from authors who intended to eulogize the Normans, for they wrote for Norman audiences and were employed by Norman patrons. Thus, the authors were significantly biased in the way they projected heroic and chivalric ideals upon their Norman protagonists. But they also must have been writing exactly what the Normans wanted to believe about themselves, and what the Normans wanted the Pope and all other Christians to believe about them. Hence, we can conclude that the Normans revered and actively cultivated their Crusader image. This form of propaganda must have stirred genuine religious feelings in the Norman knights and boosted their morale." So I think that what Brown is saying there is, while there is this very pragmatic aspect to the Norman conquest of Sicily, they were certainly willing to make alliances with Muslim princes. They weren't engaged in some sort of, all-out destruction and annihilation of the enemy religion. These ideas of holy war were very potent, and we shouldn't necessarily just dismiss them as pure propaganda. Certainly there was the propaganda element to it. The Normans were presenting themselves in this way, but there's reason to believe that this had a deep resonance with the Normans themselves, that they did feel this to some extent. We have to take that into account. We don't know how much, how little. It's very difficult to know something like that, but certainly there seems to be more to this than just mere propaganda, or at least there's good reason to think there might be. So, of course, the truth is we don't really know what deeply motivated these Normans. You can't look into someone's head and heart. You can't do that today. It's even more difficult when we're considering people who lived in the 11th century. But what can we know? Let's talk a little bit about that. What can we know for sure about the motivations of the Normans. First of all, we can say that obviously they were highly motivated by conquest. These were conquering men. The other thing is that we do have to point out that they were highly interested in being viewed as crusaders. So this we can say with certainty. For conquerors like Guiscard and Roger of Sicily, the chroniclers they were employing were portraying them this way, and especially with Roger of Sicily, as closely as he was involved in the production of Geoffrey of Malaterra's chronicle, it's clear that he was very interested in having himself portrayed in this way. Now, there is an important trap that we should avoid. We should avoid a false dichotomy here. The issue here is not that the Normans were either, motivated by this pure, unblemished sense of Christian duty, or they were purely greedy, materialistic, nihilistic conquerors. They just wanted the loot, they wanted the money, that's it. And one reason I think we have to be careful about this is that this is imposing present-day norms on the medieval era. I don't think you would find people in the Middle Ages who were sort of these present-day, I don't know, how would I put this, kind of nihilistic atheists, like people who might say, oh, this religion stuff, it's just a bunch of BS, maybe I'll use it for my own gain, but really the world is just, about getting money and getting rich, and there's nothing more to it. There's nothing spiritual out there, an attitude like that. That's a very present-day attitude. We have to remember that the 11th century, Christianity aside, this was an age of the supernatural. This was an age of, omens in the sky and, spirits moving about in the darkness at night. People had very strong supernatural beliefs. The line from which the Normans sprang, the Vikings, these Scandinavian pagans, they were very spiritual people. They had supernatural beliefs. They had this pantheon of deities. Their religion was much more this warrior type viewpoint. Warrior gods. The spiritual aspect to the military campaign, to the quest. So I think we can look at the Normans, fairly recent converts to Christianity compared to the other peoples of Western Europe. I think there was still very much a warrior religion flavor to their brand of Christianity. And I think this is actually the case probably with all of medieval history, really, in a way that we can't recognize today in present-day Christianity. This is very alien to our way of viewing Christianity today. But the fact is that medieval nobles, medieval aristocrats, tended to view God as kind of a feudal lord. I mean, even the term "our Lord." Today, there are many Christians who still use that term when referring to Jesus Christ. They call him "our Lord." Well, this goes back to the medieval era when they envisioned the supernatural, the divine order, as kind of a celestial feudal order with God at the top of it. And so if you, with your war band, you are loyal to the ultimate warrior prince, Jesus Christ, you go out and conquer, infidel territory, well, you are doing something very, very good for your God. And I think that we have every reason to think that this is somewhat how the Normans would have viewed this kind of thing. This was a very mainstream and ordinary way of viewing, religion at this time. And in fact, even earlier, if you go back to some of the early texts in the early Middle Ages, when the Germans were first being converted, they took on this idea of, okay, Christ is almost this warrior prince, and the 12 apostles are his posse of warriors, his guys. I know this sounds very strange to us, but this is how this was viewed at this time. So whereas to our perspective, going and conquering something in the name of God seems kind of alien to us, in for a medieval Norman, I think this would have made perfect sense. So what I'm saying here is that there's no reason to think that holy war and the lust for conquest were somehow in contradiction in the minds of the Normans. I think that it's very reasonable to assume that someone like Roger of Sicily would have thought to himself, yeah, I am going to conquer this territory, I'm going to become wealthy, powerful, and also I'm doing something, this is something holy that I'm doing. I'm doing this for God. I'm helping God, punish these infidels and defeat these evildoers, these rebels against his lawful authority. Because think about that. That is somewhat how these infidels, these non-Christians would have been viewed. It's like these are people in rebellion against their proper Lord. And how do medieval aristocrats deal with rebels? Well, they go to war with them. They attack them. They ravage their lands. This is the mindset. This is the mainstream attitude of the time. It's totally removed from our concept of religion, of God, but it was perfectly normal at that time. It's a different era. To demonstrate this, I'm going to read this little passage from Malaterra himself. This is from Geoffrey of Malaterra. And keep in mind, this is coming from a monk. This is somebody who's not a warrior, but who spends his life devoted to religious matters. This is what he says about this particular issue. He's talking about Roger here. He perceived two means by which he would profit, one for his soul and the other for his material benefit. If he brought back to divine worship a country given over to idolatry, and if he himself possessed the temporal fruits and income from this land, thus spending in the service of God things which had been unjustly stolen by a people who knew him not. Okay, this would, if someone were to say something like this now, like some Christian cleric or somebody who is a member of Christian clergy or something like this, were to say something like this, a lot of people would find it very shocking. It would seem radical. But for an 11th century Christian, this was very normal. Geoffrey of Malaterra is expressing an attitude that was quite normal for a medieval monk. And I think right here, just in this little passage, we are probably getting a very good idea of how Roger of Sicily viewed this, and it's not really that complicated. It's a very straightforward, and in his mind there was no contradiction. Whereas we kind of look at this whole thing and we say, okay, this was supposedly a holy war, but it was actually about conquest. What was going on here really? Was this really religious? Was it not? I think we may be kind of missing the point of how these people actually viewed this thing. And that is that there was just not a contradiction for them. This was holy war. This was war of conquest. It was the whole thing. And, if you're going to conquer something, it might as well be a holy war too. I think we have to remember too how the church was presenting this sort of thing to the Normans. The church was portraying the idea of conquering Sicily, taking it from the Muslims, as an absolutely spiritually beneficial thing. The popes encouraged this every step of the way. So the Normans had no reason to think that this was not something that was absolutely spiritually beneficial to them. So there you have it. Again, let's just close here by saying we cannot read the thoughts of people from the distant past. We don't know what any of these people really felt in their hearts, but I do think we can reasonably get an image of how people were thinking in general, what sort of ideas would have been prevalent, and I think we should be careful not to fall into the trap of taking modern perspectives and imposing them on this period, and that could sort of trip us up as we're trying to understand how someone like Roger of Sicily would have viewed his conquest of Sicily. I think Richard Brown is raising some very valid points here. His notes are incredibly useful throughout this translation. Just fascinating stuff. Excellent stuff. I hope all of you guys will check out some of his work. He has a blog called The History Zone, which is very useful. And in particular, Richard Brown, Count Roger of Sicily, Portrait of a Ruler. Really, really interesting. Geoffrey of Malaterra is one of the really great chroniclers from this period, one of the most important 11th century chroniclers. And he's also very lively and interesting to read. So, again, very affordable. You can pick up a copy of this. I will put it up on the screen. He also has a translation of William of Apulia's work, which focuses more on Robert Guiscard. So, anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this little podcast. This is an old school way of doing it. I used to do a lot more stuff like this. I haven't been doing it lately, but I do enjoy it. So, everybody take care. I'll talk to you soon.